Sometimes when you're working on a project and get to a part that's beyond repair, it makes sense to just take the easy way out. And on this project, we're going to be faced with the same situation, fix it or replace it. But just when you think we're home free, something terrible happens and it pretty much derails all our progress. Some repairs don't go according to plan, and this one is one of those repairs. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this very orange lawnmower, and the problem is that it will not start when the engine is cold, and if you do want it to start, you'll have to physically put fuel into the carb. So in the last video, we did see why it was doing this, and it has to do with the choke system not working like it should. Now, I'm going to try and repair this lawnmower, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Before we get too far into the project, I'm going to find all the stickers I can, that way we have the information we need if we need to order a part. So the sticker on the airbox is placed there for a reason, and it's to cover an access opening to the carb. And as you can tell, someone broke through the sticker, meaning they tried to make an adjustment to it. Let's just hope they knew what they were doing. Now, even though I've already checked the oil level on this engine in the last video, it has been a couple of days since then. And because this engine came to us with low oil, it's a good idea to check it again until we know for sure it's not leaking out somewhere. And luckily for us, the oil level is right where we left it from a few days ago, so there's no leak, at least not yet. Now, because of the type of fuel the last person was using in this engine, the fuel line is extremely close to failing, which means we'll need to replace the line when we work on the carb. So there's still fuel left in the tank from our last test, which we'll have to take care of before we take the fuel line off. Next, I want to show you some of the damage that's been done to this engine, and it's mainly centered around the carb. Now, I don't blame anyone for the damage because most times it is accidental, although in this case, it could have been prevented. So as you can see, we had to put washers underneath the nuts the last time, and that's because the plastic there was damaged. And when you see what happened to it, I think you'll agree that it's more of a design issue than neglect. What happened was that one of the spacers they used to keep the nut from crushing the plastic fell out, causing it to be damaged. And although it looks bad, turns out the real damage is not too far away. If I move the choke lever, you can see there's no choke flap to open or close. In fact, it looks like the post for the flap is broken, and that was the only thing securing the flap. So if you go back to some of my old videos from several years ago, you notice that I used to clamp the fuel line to prevent fuel from leaking out of the tank. Now, there's nothing wrong with this method, however you do risk damaging the fuel line when clamping it. But if you drain the fuel from the tank, it gives you a chance to inspect it, as well as check for debris at the bottom of the fuel tank. Unfortunately, they put a worm gear clamp on the line, so there's a lot of dirt stuck to the clamp. What this means is that some of that dirt will make it into the bowl I'm using to collect the fuel, making it pretty much useless as far as trying to reuse it for anything other than a cleaning solution. I was also hoping to examine the fuel that I collected in the bowl for debris or water, but that's not possible now. You'll also have to be very careful when trying to remove the original fuel line because sometimes they can get stuck to the outlet of the tank. I'm having to resort to cutting the fuel line, but even doing this is extremely dangerous because you can cut the outlet too, so just be cautious. Now, any octane of gasoline that contains ethanol is not good for any rubber components, especially the fuel line. So this is the original fuel filter that's poking out of the outlet of the tank, and I'm trying to get it out, but for some reason, it's not wanting to come out. I wanted to inspect it for a buildup of debris, but I also don't want to damage it by forcing it, so I'm going to leave it there for now. It also turns out that this linkage was homemade, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you also have to make sure that every improvised part that you make works like it should, and this one needs a bit more fine-tuning. Now, this gasket does not appear to be stock either, but hey, at least they tried. Next, we'll carefully remove the bolts that hold the bracket for the thermostat bypass, which will then give us the room we need to disconnect the other linkages. Now, I know it's just 2 more bolts, and most of it is made out of metal instead of plastic, but it's still quite cumbersome to remove. One of the good things about this carb is that it's very easy to remove since you don't have to take off any of the studs. All you have to do is move the carb away from the engine and then work the linkage and spring off the top of the carb, and then it's free from the engine. So what's the plan to fix this carb then? Well, to do that, we'd have to get a new choke flap, not to mention the shaft for it. Now, there are a couple of problems with that idea. The first being finding those parts. Simply put, they don't typically sell them individually. And secondly, if they did sell them, the price for each one would be $3 to $5, meaning it'd be close to $10 for them after shipping. And for that price, you might as well just order an aftermarket carb for it instead, which is what I intend on doing here. Of course, we'll need to remove the vacuum actuator from the old one because we'll need to swap it onto the new one, which doesn't come with one. So this is the broken shaft, and I really couldn't guess as to how this even happened, but I'd like to think that it was not broken on purpose. Now don't worry, I'm not going to get rid of this carb just yet. You never know, it might be useful on a different project. So here's the affordable carb that I'm going to be using on this engine. But just because you're buying an affordable carb doesn't mean you have to get the cheapest one you can find, but if you do, I wouldn't blame you. Now before you install the new carb, it's a good idea to check it over at least once and compare it to the old one. That way if you need to send it back, you can at least say it was never installed. So this is a brass plug that the factory installed over the adjustment screw. However, if it comes down to it, we might have to remove it so we can make some adjustments. So here's a closer view at how the flap is supposed to look when it's installed in the shaft on the carb. Now flaps on either the choke or the throttle plate don't come off by themselves very often, but in the time I've been doing this hobby, this will only be the second time to see it happen. Next, I'm going to install the vacuum actuator on the new carb, and of course don't forget to connect the vacuum line as well. Now once the line and its clamp are back in place, we'll then start the process of installing the carb back onto the engine. Now if you are worried about using a carb of questionable quality, then you can try to remove the parts you need off the new carb and then put it into the original one. However, there are no guarantees that would even work, at least not without some light modification to make up for any differences between the two carbs. The other option is to of course just buy an OEM carb, but just be prepared to pay several times more for it in comparison to the cheap one. Now, I'm not going to install this improvised linkage the correct way, which would be to go from the bottom of the opening. And the reason why is because since this is not the original part, installing it from the top of the opening works well because of how it was made. If you were to install the original linkage this way, it would rather easily pop off and cause the thermostat bypass to fail. But the likelihood that this one would do the same thing is not possible because of the hooked in on the linkage. Now I do not want to damage the opening any more than I have to in the airbox, but I don't have another insert to replace the one that's missing. But instead, I do have a piece of hard plastic which won't be as good as a metal one, but it's way better than nothing at all. So I almost forgot, we need to replace the fuel line since we had to destroy the original one when we took it off. Now the fuel line I'm using is not the best in the world, but it works well for this application since it needs to turn 90 degrees pretty quickly. If the fuel line you're going to use is extremely sturdy or if it's reinforced, making this turn will be kind of tough. And depending upon how tight the fitment is, you might not have to use a clamp, but it's a good idea to use one if you have one available. Now you can choose to install an additional fuel filter on the fuel line if you want to, but just be careful about the location you choose for it. Now the best location is most likely behind the airbox because there's plenty of room for it, but it won't be visible once the box is back on the engine. Now once the airbox has been installed, don't forget to install the emissions breather hose to it, otherwise dirt will make its way into the open port. Now even though we have the plastic spacer in the opening, I'm still going to use the washers until I can find something better to use. So I'm going to do something that you should never do because it is risky, but I'm going to try and start the engine while it's on the table so it's easier to make my adjustments. So that was very unexpected. I was preparing to replace the air filter when the engine sort of had a hiccup and then started to spray oil from the emissions tube. Now the cover for the emissions passage was already gone when we first received this mower, but it didn't matter in the first place. Its only purpose is to help direct the blow-by gases from the emissions tube back into the carb, but in this case it helped the oil make its way back into the carb instead. So obviously something terrible happened with the engine when it had that hiccup, which then caused this terrible scene you're looking at. So now comes the hard question, what happened to the engine? How do we fix it? And then what are the plans for this project now? Well, at first I thought maybe the PCV system completely failed, causing the oil to come out of the engine. However, I think the system was only doing what it was supposed to do in the event something like this should happen. So instead, I'm guessing the oil galley is being pressurized by combustion chamber pressure, but how is it getting to the galley? So here are the possible issues. There's a hole in the piston, one of the ring landings is broken, a possible valve train issue, or the head gasket is broken near the push rods. Now as for fixing it, it's going to require us to take the engine apart to find out, but is it going to be worth doing it? Now this lawnmower is not worth that much in the used market, so we could be just wasting our time on it instead of using it for something more substantial. So what's the plan then? Well, I don't know because it's a bit too early to tell, but it might be easier just to use the mower for parts instead, but you never know. So my question is, what do you think happened to the engine, and do you think it's worth the time? I know each project can be different and even unique, and so far this one is a prime example of that.
Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.